We often know salt as a spice in cooking, but did you know that salt also has a rich history associated with Christianity? Below are all the things you will know about salt, most detailed and thorough. Subscribe and follow the channel so I can produce the best quality videos for you. First, the spiritual significance of salt, preservation, purification, and seasoning. In the world of faith, there are few elements as symbolic and powerful as salt. From ancient times, salt has held profound spiritual significance, representing preservation, purification, and seasoning, three key purposes that resonate deeply in our spiritual journey. Salt is not merely a commodity for survival or cooking. It is, in a divine sense, a tool God uses to shape and strengthen His covenant with His people. By examining the biblical teachings surrounding salt, we discover that it is not just a mundane substance but a symbol of God's presence, power, and purpose in the world. The role of salt as preservation, a symbol of endurance. Salt's most well-known purpose is preservation, prevents decay, helps food last longer, and ensures the survival of what would otherwise spoil. In a spiritual sense, salt symbolizes God's preservation of His people, safeguarding them against spiritual decay and destruction. Through His covenant, God preserves His people, ensuring that His promises endure and that they remain faithful even through times of trial and temptation. Consider the story of the prophet Lot and his family. As God prepared to destroy the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, He sent angels to warn Lot and his family to flee before the judgment came. But there was one instruction when they left: they must not look back. Yet, as they were fleeing, Lot's wife, caught in a moment of hesitation and longing for the city she once called home, turned back. The result was disastrous. She was turned into a pillar of salt. Genesis 19 verse 26. In this story, salt does not just serve as a physical substance. It becomes a poignant symbol of preservation and judgment. Lot's wife, by turning back, symbolized the decay of her own faith and the inability to preserve her life in the face of God's judgment. While this may seem like a harsh punishment, the transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt serves as a solemn reminder of God's preserving power, His ability to uphold His people when they walk in obedience. Those who, like Lot, obey God's commands are preserved from the decay of sin and destruction, just as salt preserves the food it touches. But those who, like Lot's wife, turn back to their old ways or cling to the past risk becoming spiritually stagnant and unfruitful. This lesson is illustrated further in the New Testament when Jesus refers to His disciples as the salt of the earth in Matthew 5 verse 13. As the salt of the earth, believers are called to preserve the goodness and truth of God's word in a decaying world. Just as salt keeps food from spoiling, so too does the believer's presence in the world act as a preserving force, maintaining the moral and spiritual integrity of society. Purification. Salt as a symbol of cleansing. In addition to preserving, salt also plays a vital role in purification. Its cleansing properties are not only physical but symbolic of the spiritual cleansing that God offers His people. In ancient times, salt was used in various religious rituals to purify offerings, cleanse items, and prepare them for holy use. The act of purification with salt was an acknowledgement that something impure had been made clean by God's intervention. One of the most powerful examples of salt being used for purification is found in the story of Elisha in 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22. The people of Jericho, troubled by the barren state of their land, approached the prophet Elisha, seeking a solution. The water in the city was polluted, causing infertility and death to the land. Elisha instructed them to bring him a bowl of salt, which he then threw into the spring, declaring, "Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From it there shall be no more death or barrenness." The water was instantly purified, and the land became fertile again. This simple yet profound act of purifying the water with salt is a powerful symbol of how God works in our lives to cleanse and restore. The people of Jericho, once plagued by the effects of contaminated water, were now free from the curse that had held their land in desolation. Salt, consecrated by God, became the instrument of restoration. Just as the salt purified the waters, so too does God's presence purify our hearts, minds, and actions, removing the impurities that hinder us from living fully in His will. Imagine the joy and awe of the people of Jericho as they witnessed this miracle. The once toxic, stagnant water that had been the source of death and infertility was transformed into life-giving water through the simple act of sprinkling salt. In the same way, God is capable of purifying our lives, transforming our spiritual barrenness into spiritual vitality. When we bring our lives to God, He can cleanse us from all unrighteousness, restoring the areas of our lives that have been corrupted by sin and decay, seasoning salt as a spiritual flavor enhancer. Another significant aspect of salt is its ability to season, to enhance and bring out the best in food. In the Bible, salt is often used as a metaphor for the believer's role in the world. Just as salt enhances the flavor of food, believers are called to enhance the world around them by living according to God's standards. Their lives should bring out the beauty, goodness, and truth of God's kingdom, making the world a more flavorful place, even in the midst of a fallen and broken society. This principle is captured in Matthew 5 verse 13, when Jesus calls His followers the salt of the earth. Salt's ability to make things taste better parallels the believer's role in bringing the flavor of God's love, justice, and truth into the world. Through their actions, words, and example, believers can bring a spiritual flavor that draws others to Christ. The true flavor of life, according to Jesus, is found in living out the principles of God's kingdom: peace, love, justice, and grace. Imagine a young girl named Miriam, living in a bustling marketplace in a city filled with corruption. Miriam, though young, stood out because of her kindness and honesty. While others cheated and took advantage of the poor, Miriam was always quick to lend a helping hand, speak truth, and offer hope to those around her. One day, a weary traveler approached her, discouraged by the hardness of the world. He asked her, "How do you remain so hopeful in such a dark place?" Miriam smiled gently and replied, "Because I know that even in the darkest places, God can make the world taste better. I try to be His salt, bringing peace, joy, and love wherever I go." Miriam understood the profound truth that salt does more than preserve and purify. It enhances life, making it richer and fuller. By living as God's salt in the world, she brought His flavor into the lives of those around her, drawing them closer to the kingdom of God. Salt in covenant, a reminder of unbreakable promises. Finally, salt is used in the Bible as a symbol of covenant. The covenant of salt represents the unbreakable promises between God and His people. It is a sign that God's commitment to His people is eternal and steadfast. In Numbers 18:19, God says to the Israelites, "Whatever is set aside from the holy offerings the Israelites present to the Lord, I give to you and your sons and daughters as your regular share. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for both you and me." Salt's permanence and preservation qualities make it an appropriate symbol for such a covenant. Just as salt does not lose its ability to preserve, God's covenant with His people is eternal and unchanging. It is a reminder that, even when we fail, God remains faithful to His promises. The use of salt in covenant rituals signifies that God's commitment to His people is as enduring as salt itself. Consider a faithful servant named Ezekiel, who, after many years of serving in the temple, found himself questioning God's promises in the face of personal tragedy. He had seen the people around him suffer, and his faith had begun to waver. One day, while reflecting on the covenant God had made with His people, Ezekiel recalled the ancient practice of using salt in covenant rituals. He remembered that salt, in its enduring nature, was a symbol of God's unbreakable promises. In a moment of clarity, Ezekiel took a small bowl of salt, consecrated it with prayer, and placed it on the altar, declaring, "God, your covenant with us is as eternal as salt. Even in the midst of suffering, I know you will never leave or forsake us." In that moment, The salt was more than just a substance. It became a sign of God's unwavering faithfulness and a reminder that His promises are not only for the past but for the present and future as well. Through salt, Ezekiel was able to reaffirm his faith in God's unchanging nature, and it became a powerful reminder to him and to all believers that God's promises, like salt, will endure forever. In these ways, salt in the Bible serves not only as a practical element but also as a powerful spiritual symbol. Whether preserving, purifying, or seasoning, salt teaches us important lessons about God's ongoing work in the world and His enduring covenant with His people. Salt reminds us of the roles we play in God's grand plan, preserving truth, purifying hearts, and enhancing the world with the flavor of His love. It is a call to recognize the deeper spiritual significance behind the ordinary and to embrace the power that God has given us through His eternal promises. Secondly, biblical usage of salt, purification, offerings, and covenants. In the Bible, salt is much more than a simple mineral. It is imbued with deep spiritual significance. Throughout the Scriptures, salt is used to symbolize purification, sanctification, and even covenantal faithfulness. Its presence in various rituals and practices underscores its role as a sacred substance, connecting the material world to the divine. Through vivid stories, the Bible shows how salt transcends its ordinary role in everyday life, becoming a powerful tool in God's hands for both physical and spiritual restoration. Salt as a purifying agent. Imagine a small, bustling village in ancient Israel. The year is uncertain, but the seasons have been unkind to the people. Crops have failed, and the land itself seems to reject them. A dark shadow hangs over the village, for the well that serves the entire community has been poisoned. Water, the very lifeblood of the people, is undrinkable, causing sickness and despair. The elders call for Elisha, the prophet who is known for his ability to perform miracles. Elisha arrives, and the villagers gather in silence, unsure of what to expect. With a quiet authority, Elisha instructs them to bring him a bowl of salt. "Bring me a new bowl," he commands, "and put salt in it." The people, still confused, follow his directions. When the salt is brought, Elisha walks toward the poisoned spring and, without hesitation, casts the salt into the water. The village watches in stunned silence. "Thus says the Lord," Elisha declares, "I have healed this water. From it there shall be no more death or barrenness." Immediately, the water is restored to purity, and the land begins to flourish once again. Crops begin to grow, and life returns to the village. The people rejoice, and their faith in God is strengthened. This story of Elisha purifying the water with salt is a powerful example of how salt symbolizes purification in the Bible. Just as salt has the ability to preserve and purify food, it also has the divine power to cleanse and restore, demonstrating God's ability to take something simple and use it for miraculous purposes. Salt, in this case, serves as a conduit for God's power to heal and revitalize. Salt in offerings and rituals. In addition to purification, salt plays a significant role in biblical offerings and rituals. Salt was considered an essential part of any sacrifice offered to God. The book of Leviticus tells us that all offerings made to the Lord were to be seasoned with salt, as a sign of the covenant between God and His people. The phrase, "the salt of the covenant," appears multiple times in the Bible, emphasizing the unbreakable nature of God's promises to His people. In one notable passage from Leviticus 2 verse 13, it says, "You shall season all your grain offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt." Here, salt symbolizes the enduring nature of God's covenant. It serves as a reminder that, just as salt preserves food, God's covenant with His people is eternal and unchanging. The presence of salt in the offerings serves to reinforce the idea that God's promises are as unyielding and enduring as the salt itself. Salt in covenants. Salt also plays a critical role in covenant making in the Bible. In the ancient world, A covenant was often sealed by the sharing of a meal or the exchange of a symbolic object. Salt, being a valuable and essential commodity, was often used to seal these covenants, ensuring that the bond between two parties was sacred and lasting. One example of this is found in the book of Numbers, where God commands Moses to make a covenant with the Israelites that would endure forever. The covenant is described as a salt covenant, signifying its permanence. In Numbers 18:19, God says, "All the holy offerings which the children of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and your daughters with you, as an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord, to you and your descendants with you." This salt covenant symbolizes not only the enduring relationship between God and Israel, but also the loyalty and faithfulness required from his people. Just as salt cannot lose its flavor or value, the covenant between God and his people is meant to be unbreakable and eternal. Salt, in this sense, is not just an ingredient in food or an element in rituals. It is a symbol of the steadfast loyalty and faithfulness that God expects from his people. The story of Lot's wife, salt as a warning. Another compelling story involving salt comes from the account of Lot and his wife in the book of Genesis. As the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are about to be destroyed for their wickedness, the angelic messengers instruct Lot and his family to flee the city and not look back. Yet, as they escape the destruction, Lot's wife, in a moment of longing or perhaps regret, looks back at the burning city. The consequence of this act is swift and severe. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Genesis 19 verse 26. The transformation of Lot's wife into a pillar of salt is both a literal and metaphorical warning. Salt, which often symbolizes preservation and the eternal nature of covenants, here represents something different: the irreversible consequences of disobedience. Lot's wife's act of looking back at Sodom, a city full of sin and corruption, symbolizes her attachment to the past and refusal to fully embrace the future God had promised. The salt pillar stands as a stark reminder that the past, when it is tied to sin and rebellion, cannot be revisited without consequence. Salt in the New Testament, a call to faithfulness. The teachings of Jesus also reinforce the spiritual significance of salt. In Matthew 5 verse 13, he calls his followers the salt of the earth, emphasizing their role in the world as agents of preservation and transformation. In this context, salt is not merely a symbol of purity, but also of the influence that believers are called to have on the world. Just as salt enhances the flavor of food, Christians are meant to enhance the moral and spiritual flavor of the world around them. The metaphor of salt in the New Testament reminds believers that their faith should make a tangible difference in the world. Just as salt cannot lose its flavor and become useless, Christians too must remain faithful to their calling, preserving the values of God's kingdom on earth. Salt in the Bible is far more than a seasoning or preservative. It is a profound symbol of purification, covenant, and faithfulness through its use in purifying water, sealing covenants, and symbolizing the eternal promises of God. Salt becomes a powerful reminder of the lasting and sacred relationship between God and his people. The stories surrounding salt in the Bible teach us that, like salt, we are called to preserve, purify, and remain faithful in our relationship with God, ensuring that his promises to us remain as enduring as the salt itself. Number 3, the historical and cultural role of salt in the Bible. Throughout history, salt has held an extraordinary value that transcends its simple role as a seasoning or preservative. In ancient cultures, salt was not just a commodity, but a symbol of wealth, power, and trust. In the Bible, salt's cultural significance is woven throughout the stories and teachings, reflecting its vital role in daily life and its connection to divine practices. Salt is a symbol of loyalty, preservation, and the enduring nature of God's promises, making it one of the most powerful and enduring elements in biblical tradition. Salt as currency and a symbol of value. Let's step back in time to a bustling market square in ancient Israel. It's the height of summer, and traders from distant lands are haggling over goods under the scorching sun. Among the items being traded, one stands out: not gold, nor fine silks, but salt. This humble mineral, so abundant in nature, is being exchanged with as much reverence as any precious gem. Traders understand that salt is not only valuable for its ability to preserve food, but also for its role as a form of currency. It is essential to daily life, and its scarcity in certain regions makes it an even more prized possession. Imagine a young merchant, Isaac, who has just inherited his father's trade route. Isaac is determined to prove himself. He knows that salt is a high-demand commodity, especially in places where it's not naturally abundant. So, he gathers his goods, salt from the Dead Sea, and heads toward a neighboring kingdom. Along the way, he meets a weary traveler, an older man named Gad, who is desperate to buy food but has little money. Isaac, seeing an opportunity, offers him some of his precious salt in exchange for a promise that they will meet again and Gad will repay him when he can. The deal is sealed with salt, a symbol of the sacred bond between them. This is no mere exchange of goods. It's a transaction that signifies trust and a lasting commitment, one that both men know will not easily be broken. Salt, as we see here, wasn't just a commodity. It was used to signify agreements and covenants. This practice was not unique to Israel. In many ancient cultures, salt was considered sacred and valuable enough to seal important agreements, just as it was used to guarantee the preservation of food. In fact, the word salary itself is derived from salt. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, highlighting its importance as a form of currency. It was so valuable that the expression "worth one's salt" was coined, referring to someone who is worthy of the reward or payment they receive. Salt as a symbol of trust and loyalty. In many Eastern traditions, salt has long been regarded as a symbol of trust, loyalty, and eternal commitment. A fascinating story emerges from the ancient Middle East, where salt was used to seal friendships and pacts. Let us consider the story of two tribes, the Nadir and the Hashemite. For years, these tribes had been enemies, with bitter conflicts that spanned generations. However, an opportunity for peace arises when a wise elder from the Hashemite tribe proposes a unique solution. He suggests that the two tribes meet and share a meal, seasoned with salt, as a symbol of the new bond they could form. The Nadir tribe is hesitant, after all. They have a long history of distrust. But the elder reassures them that this act of sharing salt will be a sacred promise of loyalty and peace. The meal is prepared, and salt is sprinkled over the bread they break together. At that moment, both tribes realize that the salt is more than just an ingredient. It represents a new beginning. The tribes understand that once they share salt, the bond is unbreakable. It is a promise that neither will break faith with the other. For to betray a pact sealed with salt is to destroy the very trust upon which life itself depends. From that day forward, the two tribes live in peace, their bond fortified by the sacred salt shared between them. This cultural practice of using salt to symbolize trust is not just found in ancient Middle Eastern cultures, but also in biblical stories. In the Old Testament, God instructs his people to season their offerings with salt, reinforcing the idea of an eternal, unbreakable covenant. Salt was seen as a guarantee of lasting loyalty, as seen in passages like Leviticus 2 verse 13 and 2 Chronicles 13 verse 5, where it emphasizes that the covenant of salt is an everlasting covenant with God. It's a spiritual act that mirrors the loyalty and commitment required in human relationships. Salt in ancient covenants. Returning to the biblical narrative, the use of salt in covenants takes on a divine significance. One of the clearest examples is in the book of Numbers, where God commands that salt be included in the offerings of his people as a symbol of the covenant. In Numbers 18:19, it says, "All the holy offerings which the children of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and your daughters with you, as an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord, to you and your descendants with you." In this context, salt represents something far greater than a simple seasoning. It is a symbol of God's unbreakable promise to his people. A covenant of salt is everlasting. Just as salt itself does not decay or lose its flavor, this covenant symbolized the permanence and faithfulness of God's relationship with Israel. The people of Israel were instructed to offer salt with their sacrifices as a reminder that their relationship with God was both sacred and eternal, like the salt that preserved their offerings. Imagine a priest standing before the altar, sprinkling salt over the offerings. The air is thick with incense, and the people are gathered in reverence. As the salt falls upon the sacrifices, it is not just a ritual, it is a declaration of faith, a reminder that their covenant with God is unbroken and everlasting. The salt serves as a living reminder that God's promises are steadfast, unchanging, and meant to last throughout the generations. Salt and the preservation of life. In an age where refrigeration was unheard of, salt was a vital tool for preserving food. It kept meat from spoiling and ensured that food could last through long winters or during times of famine. This practical use of salt is also echoed in the spiritual lessons of the Bible. Consider the story of the prophet Ezekiel, who receives a vision of dry bones in a valley. The bones are scattered, lifeless, and dry, symbolic of a people who have lost their hope and their faith. But God speaks to Ezekiel, telling him to prophesy to the bones, saying, "I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life." Ezekiel 37 verse 5. As the bones come together and are covered with flesh, they are still lifeless until God commands Ezekiel to prophesy to the breath of life to enter them. What does this have to do with salt? The salt is the preservative element, the living reminder of God's sustaining power. Just as salt preserves food from decay, the breath of God will preserve the people of Israel from spiritual decay, offering them new life and a new beginning. The preservation of life through salt is a central theme not just in physical terms, but in the spiritual realm, where God's promises are the eternal sustenance that keeps his people from withering away. Salt in everyday life, a symbol of the kingdom. Salt's everyday role as a preservative and seasoning also underscores its deeper spiritual significance. Jesus himself used salt as a metaphor for his followers in Matthew 5 verse 13 when he declared, "You are the salt of the earth." This statement would have resonated deeply with those who knew the value of salt in daily life. Just as salt preserves food from spoiling, Christians are called to preserve the moral and spiritual fabric of the world. The message was clear. Followers of Christ are to be active, preserving the goodness of the world around them and enhancing the lives of those they encounter. As salt enhances the flavor of food, so too should Christians enhance the world with their faith, kindness, and righteousness. Through all these stories, the cultural role of salt in the Bible becomes evident. It is more than a mere element. It is a powerful symbol of trust, loyalty, preservation, and the eternal nature of God's promises. Salt binds people together, seals covenants, and sustains life, both physically and spiritually, serving as a constant reminder of God's faithfulness and his call to his people to be agents of preservation and transformation in the world. Number 4. Spiritual warfare with salt, a divine weapon against evil forces. In the Bible, salt is not merely a mundane substance. It holds profound spiritual significance, especially in the context of spiritual warfare. It is portrayed as a divine weapon capable of purging evil forces, sanctifying spaces, and restoring purity. Through the symbolic power of salt, believers are reminded that they are equipped with heavenly resources to fight against darkness and establish God's kingdom on earth. The stories of salt used in spiritual warfare not only illustrate its purifying properties, but also highlight the believer's role in protecting their home, community, and spirit from the forces of evil. Salt as a weapon to purify and bless. Consider the story of a small village in ancient Israel, a place nestled between rolling hills and vineyards. This village had always been peaceful, but in recent months, strange occurrences had begun to plague the community. Crops were failing, families were falling ill, and a dark, oppressive atmosphere hung in the air. The villagers whispered of an ancient curse. believing that an evil spirit had been unleashed upon their land. Desperate for a solution, a young woman named Miriam, whose father had once been a priest, recalled an old story she had heard as a child. She remembered her father speaking of how salt could be consecrated and used to break the hold of evil. Miriam, deeply troubled by the suffering of her people, decided to take matters into her own hands. She gathered a small bowl of salt and went to the central well, where the community drew its water. The water had become tainted with something sinister, as if a dark force had seeped into the very lifeblood of the village. Holding the bowl of salt tightly, Miriam knelt by the well and prayed, "Lord, purify this water. Let this salt be a symbol of your power and your purity. Let it break the curse that binds this land." With faith and determination, she poured the salt into the well. Immediately, the air seemed to shift, and a sense of peace descended over the village. The oppressive weight that had loomed for weeks began to lift. Within days, crops began to grow again, the sick began to recover, and the villagers felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Miriam's act of faith, using salt to purify the land, had successfully broken the spiritual chains that bound the village. This story illustrates how salt, when consecrated for divine purposes, becomes a powerful tool in spiritual warfare. In the Bible, salt is not only used to purify and protect physical spaces, but also to cleanse spiritual realms from the influence of evil. Miriam's action is reminiscent of the stories in Scripture, where salt is used to break the chains of corruption and establish a space where God's presence can dwell. Salt as a means of cursing evil forces, in contrast to salt's use in purification and blessing. The Bible also reveals its potential to curse evil forces and those who oppose God's will. One of the most striking examples of salt being used in this way is found in the story of King Jehoram in 2 Kings 3 verses 19 to 20. When Israel was at war with Moab, the prophet Elisha gave a dire prophecy to the king of Israel, instructing him to dig ditches in the valley. The following day, the water that was promised to the Israelites flowed into the ditches, bringing salvation to their army. However, in the aftermath of the battle, Elisha was not finished with his work. The Moabites, who had been defeated, had left their fields barren and their cities desolate. Elisha instructed the Israelites to take salt and scatter it across the land. The salt, a symbol of purification and preservation, was now used to bring a curse upon the land of Moab. The Moabite cities, once thriving, became uninhabitable, their fields salt-soaked and barren. The land, cursed by the salt, would not produce food again. This act of using salt to pronounce judgment and desolation on the enemy is a powerful reminder of salt's role in spiritual warfare. In this case, the salt was not used to preserve life, but to destroy the forces of evil that opposed God's people. It was a divine act of judgment, demonstrating that salt is a tool not only of protection but also of spiritual power against the forces of darkness. The enemy's corruption of salt. However, salt, as a symbol of God's purity and power, is also susceptible to corruption. In the Bible, we are warned that salt can lose its effectiveness if it becomes contaminated or defiled. In Matthew 5 verse 13, Jesus speaks of salt that has lost its flavor. And in this metaphor, he warns his followers about losing their spiritual vitality and purpose. If the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? He asks. It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. This warning extends beyond the literal use of salt. It serves as a cautionary tale for believers in spiritual warfare. Just as salt can lose its potency, so too can a believer lose their spiritual strength if they allow themselves to be tainted by sin, doubt, or worldly distractions. In spiritual warfare, it is crucial to ensure that the salt, symbolizing God's power and purity, is not corrupted by evil forces. The enemy seeks to twist and pervert the power of salt, turning it from a tool of God into an instrument of witchcraft and occult practices. In some cultures, salt was historically used in dark rituals, attempting to reverse its divine properties and harness its power for evil purposes. These practices stand in stark contrast to the biblical use of salt, which is always meant to purify, protect, and bless, never to curse or defile. For believers, the message is clear: salt must be consecrated, set apart, and used according to God's will, lest it be corrupted by the enemy. Salt as a symbol of protection in spiritual warfare. Salt is also a potent symbol of protection. In ancient times, it was common to scatter salt around one's home or possessions to ward off evil spirits and prevent curses. This practice is still carried out in some cultures today, where salt is believed to provide spiritual protection against dark forces. In the book of Ezekiel, God commands the prophet to mark the foreheads of the righteous with a seal as a sign of protection from the coming judgment. Ezekiel 9 verse 4. Though the specific use of salt is not mentioned, the concept of a seal of protection can be closely linked to the power of consecrated salt in spiritual warfare. Just as the seal on the righteous protects them from harm, salt is seen as a seal of divine protection, preserving homes, families, and even individuals from spiritual attack. A story from a small rural town provides a modern example of this practice. A woman named Sarah had recently moved into an old house, and soon after settling in, she began experiencing unsettling events. Objects in her home would move on their own, doors would creak open at night, and an eerie feeling filled the air. Fearful and unsure of what to do, Sarah turned to her grandmother, a wise woman who had always spoken of the power of salt. Her grandmother told her to take a bowl of salt, pray over it, and sprinkle it in every corner of the house, especially near the doors and windows. As Sarah followed her grandmother's instructions, she felt an overwhelming peace fill the home. The strange occurrences stopped, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Sarah's faith, coupled with the power of consecrated salt, had turned her home into a sanctuary, shielded from the forces that once sought to disturb her peace. This modern-day example is a powerful reminder that the use of salt in spiritual warfare is not just a biblical tradition. It is a living practice that can bring tangible, divine protection against evil forces, whether used to purify, protect, or break the power of evil. Salt remains a spiritual tool that believers can wield with faith and intention, invoking God's power to stand firm against the enemy. Salt and the believer's role in spiritual warfare. In every story of salt in spiritual warfare, there is one consistent theme: the believer's role as an active participant in the battle between good and evil. Whether purifying a cursed land, sealing a covenant, or protecting a home, the believer is called to use salt as a tool in their spiritual armor, always under the guidance of God's will. Salt, as a symbol of God's purity, protection, and judgment, reminds us that spiritual warfare is not a passive endeavor. Just as salt can both purify and curse, so too can our actions in the spiritual realm either bring peace or disrupt the enemy's plans. As believers, we are called to consecrate our lives, our homes, and our communities with the purity and power of God's Spirit, using tools like salt to resist the darkness and bring about God's kingdom on earth. In every battle, spiritual or physical, salt remains a powerful symbol of God's divine authority, a reminder that no evil force can withstand His purifying, preserving power. Number 5. Prophetic acts and elements. The power of salt and natural elements in divine purpose. Throughout the Bible, prophets often use simple, everyday elements to fulfill God's will and bring about divine interventions. These physical substances, whether it be salt, water, mud, or even fire, are transformed by the hand of God into powerful symbols of spiritual truths and miraculous events. Among these elements, salt stands out for its use in prophetic acts, where it serves as both a tool of divine purification and a means to reveal God's authority over both the spiritual and physical realms. From the purification of water to the sealing of covenants, salt is used in prophetic acts to manifest God's power and to guide His people toward restoration and righteousness. The story of Elisha and the healing of the bitter water, One of the most compelling stories involving salt in prophetic acts comes from the ministry of the prophet Elisha. After the death of Elijah, Elisha took up the mantle of his mentor, but his path was not without challenges. One such challenge came when Elisha entered the city of Jericho, known for its ancient history and towering walls. But its people were suffering from a bitter curse. The city's water supply, the lifeblood of the community, had become contaminated. The wells were poisoned, causing the crops to fail and the people to fall ill. The residents of Jericho were desperate and turned to Elisha for help. Led by faith and with a deep understanding of God's ability to use even the simplest elements for miraculous purposes, Elisha called for a bowl of salt. Standing by the bitter well, Elisha took the salt and threw it into the water, declaring, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." 2 Kings 2 verses 21 to 22. Instantly, the water was purified, and the land was healed. The people of Jericho were astonished. The salt, an ordinary substance in everyday life, had been used to reverse a curse and restore life to the land. Imagine the scene. A crowd of villagers gathered around the well, watching in disbelief as Elisha, with a quiet authority, tossed salt into the water. The moment the salt touched the surface, the air seemed to shift. What was once a stagnant, polluted source of death became a pure, life-giving stream. It was a powerful reminder that God's intervention could transform even the most hopeless situations. The simple act of using salt became a prophetic act of restoration, showing that God's healing touch could reach even the most seemingly insignificant parts of creation. Prophets and the use of natural elements. Elisha's use of salt to purify the water is just one example of how prophets in the Bible utilized natural elements to fulfill God's purposes. These elements, water, salt, and even mud, were not worshipped, but used to convey deeper spiritual truths and to reveal God's power over both the natural and supernatural realms. Take, for instance, the story of the prophet Moses, who, in obedience to God's command, struck a rock to bring forth water in the desert. Exodus 17 verse 6. The water that flowed from the rock wasn't just for physical sustenance. It was a prophetic act that symbolized the living water of God's provision. In the New Testament, Jesus himself would refer to this moment when he offered the Samaritan woman living water. John 4 verse 10. In this way, Moses' act of striking the rock with his staff was more than just an act of physical provision. It was a prophetic declaration of God's ability to provide spiritual nourishment, even in the driest places. Similarly, in the book of Ezekiel, God uses the prophet to demonstrate his power over the dead and the lost. Ezekiel is commanded to prophesy to a valley of dry bones, telling them to hear the word of the Lord. Ezekiel 37 verse 4. As Ezekiel speaks, the bones begin to reassemble and are covered with flesh, brought back to life by the breath of God. This prophetic act, involving the very elements of the earth, showcases God's dominion over life and death. It was not Ezekiel who resurrected the bones, but the Spirit of God working through the prophet to reveal divine truth. In these stories, we see how physical elements are woven into the fabric of prophecy. Just as salt was used by Elisha to heal the bitter waters, so too were rocks, bones, and even the very earth itself used as instruments to reveal God's power and purposes. The prophets never worshipped the elements. Rather, they used them as vessels to carry God's message and perform his will. Jesus and the use of physical elements for spiritual healing. The ultimate fulfillment of these prophetic acts came in the person of Jesus Christ, who often used physical elements to demonstrate spiritual healing and divine power. In the Gospel of John, Jesus performs one of his most famous miracles, healing a blind man by using mud. Jesus spat on the ground, made mud with his saliva, and anointed the man's eyes with the mud, instructing him to wash in the pool of Siloam. John 9 verses 6 to 7. At first glance, this may seem like an unusual method for healing, but it is deeply symbolic. The act of using mud to heal the man's blindness goes beyond the physical act of restoring sight. Jesus, the Creator, was demonstrating his authority over both the physical and spiritual realms. The mud, formed from the dust of the earth, was a symbol of how God could take the most ordinary of elements, earth, water, saliva, and transform them into instruments of miraculous healing. It was also a reflection of the biblical truth that humanity itself was formed from the dust of the earth, Genesis 2 verse 7, and through Christ, the Creator was restoring sight to his creation. As the man washed in the pool of Siloam, his sight was restored. But this healing was not just a physical transformation. It was a prophetic act. Jesus was revealing that he had the power to heal not just physical blindness, but also spiritual blindness. By using the physical elements of mud and water, he was pointing to the deeper spiritual reality that only through him could true sight and understanding be restored. Salt as a symbol of God's authority over both realms. In all of these prophetic acts, whether it's Elisha healing the water with salt or Jesus healing the blind man with mud, one thing remains clear: the natural elements themselves are not worshipped or revered. Rather, they are used as vessels to reveal God's authority over both the physical and spiritual realms. Salt, in particular, is a powerful symbol of God's sovereignty. When used in prophetic acts, it is not just salt, it becomes an instrument through which God's will is accomplished. This idea is reinforced by the Apostle Paul's teachings in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 24 to 28, where he speaks of Christ reigning over all things. The physical world is not separate from the spiritual world, but is part of God's redemptive plan. The use of elements like salt and mud in prophetic acts reminds us that the material world is not devoid of spiritual meaning. Rather, it is a medium through which God often works to fulfill his divine purposes. Imagine, then, the role of a modern-day believer in this divine drama. Just as the prophets of old used salt, water, and mud to demonstrate God's power, so too are we called to recognize the spiritual significance in the natural world around us. We are not to worship the elements themselves, but to understand that they serve as symbols of God's presence and power. Whether it's salt used to consecrate a space, water used in baptism to symbolize new life, or bread and wine used in communion to represent Christ's body and blood, these physical elements become deeply connected to spiritual truths. The prophetic power of simple elements. Through the use of elements like salt, water, and mud, prophets in the Bible demonstrate how ordinary substances can be used for extraordinary purposes. These elements are not sacred in themselves, but rather, they become powerful tools in God's hands, through which his purposes are revealed. Salt, in particular, stands out as a symbol of purification, healing, and divine authority. From Elisha's healing of the waters of Jericho to the transformative power of Jesus' mud healing, salt and other natural elements remind us that God is at work in the world around us, using the simplest of things to fulfill his greater spiritual purposes. Number 6, the covenant of salt, an eternal promise of faithfulness. Salt has long been associated with covenant and commitment, especially in the Bible, where it symbolizes an unbreakable bond between God and his people. The covenant of salt is a profound symbol of God's everlasting faithfulness, promise that can never be broken, and an emblem of purity and preservation. Salt, as a substance that preserves and sustains, is an apt metaphor for the unending covenant that God establishes with his people, one that endures through generations. Despite trials, betrayals, and human frailty through the ages, this covenant has shaped the identity of God's chosen people, reminding them of their sacred relationship with him. The ancient covenant of salt in Numbers and Chronicles. The concept of the covenant of salt is first mentioned in the book of Numbers, 18:19, where God tells the Israelites, "All the holy offerings the Israelites give to the Lord I give to you and your sons and daughters as your perpetual share. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for both you and your offspring." This is part of God's promise to the priestly tribe of Levi, symbolizing the eternal relationship between God and his people through the sacrifices and offerings made in the temple. Imagine, if you will, the scene in the ancient tabernacle, the sacred tent that served as the Israelites' place of worship in the wilderness. The priests, robed in white, gather around the altar where they present offerings to God. As they sprinkle salt on the sacrifices, it is not just an act of ritual but a deep, symbolic gesture. The salt signifies God's promise that these offerings, and the priests themselves, are preserved in holiness before him. This act is a reminder that their covenant with God is not temporary or fleeting but is as enduring as the salt that never loses its flavor. The salt preserved the offering, just as God's faithfulness preserves his people through time. It is fascinating to think about the salt's role in this moment. Salt, in its very nature, resists decay, keeps food fresh, and is vital for preservation. In the same way, God's covenant, like salt, ensures that his promises will never decay or fade. No matter how much time passes, the bond between God and his people remains intact, an eternal promise that is sealed and secured by his divine faithfulness. King David and the covenant of salt. One of the most striking examples of the covenant of salt appears in the book of 2 Chronicles, where King David reminds the people of Israel about God's unbreakable promises. David, the man after God's own heart, understood the importance of covenant and the need to honor it, even in the face of challenges. During a particularly turbulent period in Israel's history, when King David was consolidating power and establishing his kingdom, he made a pact with the tribe of Judah, which was solidified by salt. David and the elders of Judah shared a meal together, and during the feast, salt was used as a symbol of their agreement. This was not just a social gesture, it was a sacred act. By sharing salt, they were acknowledging the eternal nature of their covenant and the shared responsibility they had toward each other and towards God. The scene is vivid. In the great hall of King David's palace, the king and his leaders sit together, the light of the fire casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. As they break bread and pass around the salt, a sacred moment passes between them. The salt, simple and humble, becomes a seal of their covenant. They are bound together not just by political power, but by a divine promise that transcends time. The salt, a humble and everyday element, becomes the very symbol of God's steadfast love and commitment. This covenant of salt was meant to remind them that their relationship with God was one of mutual faithfulness. Just as the salt preserved the food, so too would God's faithfulness preserve his people. And just as salt was meant to enhance the flavor of food, God's covenant was meant to enrich and enhance the lives of those who walked in his ways. The covenant was not just a promise of protection. It was a promise of blessing, peace, and a continual outpouring of God's goodness. Betrayal of the covenant of salt. While salt was seen as a symbol of God's enduring covenant, the betrayal of this covenant was considered a grave offense, something that could lead to severe consequences. The Bible illustrates the seriousness of breaking this sacred bond through various stories of disobedience and rebellion. One such story can be found in the case of King Solomon's son, Rehoboam. When Rehoboam succeeded Solomon as king, he faced a crucial test. The people of Israel came to him, asking for lighter burdens and fairer treatment. As Solomon had taxed them heavily, Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father. But ultimately he chose to follow the advice of his young companions, who encouraged him to be harsh with the people. As a result, 10 tribes of Israel rebelled, and the kingdom was divided. The covenant that had been established with David and his descendants was now in jeopardy. Rehoboam's decision to disregard the wisdom of his elders, and in turn, to break the covenant, had dire consequences. While the salt of the covenant had once symbolized unity and faithfulness, it now symbolized the breach of that trust and the collapse of a once united kingdom. Rehoboam's betrayal of this sacred agreement led to the division of the kingdom, and the people of Israel were left fractured and vulnerable. The story of Rehoboam serves as a warning. Breaking the covenant of salt, that unbreakable bond with God, is not only a betrayal of God's promises but also a betrayal of the community that God has built. The salt, which was meant to preserve, becomes a symbol of desolation when the covenant is ignored or broken. The lasting power of the covenant of salt. Despite moments of betrayal and disobedience, God's covenant of salt endures, unwavering in its power. The Bible assures us that God's faithfulness is not contingent upon our faithfulness but is rooted in His unchanging nature. This enduring covenant finds its ultimate fulfillment in the new covenant through Jesus Christ. The salt covenant in the Old Testament points forward to the ultimate act of love and faithfulness, Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. In the New Testament, Jesus declares a new and everlasting covenant sealed by His blood. The bread and wine of communion become the new symbols of this covenant. But the idea of salt remains embedded in the promise of preservation and faithfulness. Just as salt never loses its saltiness, so too does God's commitment to His people remain constant, unbroken, and eternal. Through Christ, the covenant is no longer just for Israel, but for all who believe in Him. The church, as the new people of God, is called to walk in this covenant, living lives of faithfulness, commitment, and preservation, just as salt preserves food from decay. The bond established through Christ is eternal, marked by His promise to never leave or forsake His people. A living example of the covenant. In a small town, there lived a family that had been facing generational struggles. For years, they dealt with illness, poverty, and broken relationships. But one day, the family patriarch, an elderly man who had lived a life of quiet faith, sat his children and grandchildren down and spoke of the covenant of salt. He told them how salt, a simple thing, symbolized the promise of God's faithfulness. He reminded them that God had promised to preserve them, to keep them, and to bless them, as long as they remained faithful to Him. To make this promise tangible, the patriarch took a small bowl of salt and sprinkled a little on each person's head, just as the ancient priests had done in times past. It was a simple act, but it carried profound meaning. As the salt touched their heads, the family knew that this was not just an ordinary gesture. It was a reminder that they were part of an eternal covenant with God, a covenant that would preserve them through all trials and hardships. The family saw a change after that day. The illnesses that had plagued them began to lessen. The relationships that had been strained started to heal. There was a renewed sense of hope and purpose as the family walked forward, trusting in God's promise to preserve and protect them. The covenant of salt, once an ancient practice, had become a living, breathing reality for them. A constant reminder that God's promises are as sure and enduring as salt itself. The unbreakable promise. Through these examples, we see how the covenant of salt is not just a ritual but a living testimony of God's enduring faithfulness. The salt symbolizes purity, preservation, and an unbreakable bond that cannot be undone. Whether in the days of Moses, David, or Jesus, God's promises remain steadfast and unchanging, a testament to His eternal love and faithfulness to His people. The covenant of salt reminds us that, though we may falter or fail, God's love and His promises will never fail us. Number 7. Practical applications. Consecrating salt for spiritual use. Salt has been revered not only for its practical applications in daily life, but also for its deep spiritual significance. In the Bible, salt is used for purification, preservation, and as a symbol of divine covenant. But beyond these ancient rituals, the practice of consecrating salt for spiritual use remains relevant today for believers seeking to sanctify their homes, offerings, and lives. Salt, when dedicated to God, becomes a powerful tool in spiritual warfare, healing, and blessing. The act of consecrating salt isn't just a symbolic gesture. It carries with it a profound reminder of God's power to purify and protect. The ritual of consecrating salt. The process of consecrating salt is simple yet deeply meaningful. It involves setting apart a portion of salt for sacred use, praying over it, and dedicating it to God. This act is based on the biblical understanding that salt, by its very nature, symbolizes purity, preservation, and sanctification. When believers pray over salt and dedicate it to God, they are acknowledging God's authority over both the spiritual and material realms. This act becomes an offering, turning something as mundane as salt into a holy instrument for divine purposes. Imagine, in a small home nestled in a quiet town, a family gathers together for a time of prayer. The mother, inspired by the teachings of Scripture, has brought a small bowl of salt before the family. She sets it on the table, explaining that they will consecrate it as a symbol of God's presence in their lives. As they bow their heads in prayer, she speaks of God's power to purify their hearts and their home, and they ask for His protection, peace, and blessing. The salt is lifted, sanctified, and declared holy. It is now more than just an element in the kitchen. It is a tool of divine purpose, set apart for God's glory. This act of consecration is powerful because it aligns the material world with the spiritual. The salt, once a common substance, is transformed through prayer and devotion. It becomes a reminder that everything in the believer's life, from the mundane to the miraculous, belongs to God and can be used for His purposes. Salt as a tool for purification. One of the most profound practical uses of consecrated salt is for purification. In the Bible, salt is often associated with cleansing. In 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22, Elisha uses salt to purify the water in the city of Jericho, restoring the land and making it fruitful again. The salt in this story was not just a substance. It was an instrument of divine purification. A similar story can be found in the modern world, where consecrated salt is used to cleanse a home or a place of business. For example, a believer might feel a strong sense of spiritual oppression in their home or workplace. Perhaps there is a feeling of unease, or a relationship that feels toxic. In these moments, they may turn to consecrated salt for help. By sprinkling salt around the home or in specific areas of conflict, they symbolically purify the space, asking God to remove any spiritual darkness or negative influences. Let's imagine a young couple struggling with tension in their relationship and a sense of spiritual unrest in their home. One evening, the wife, remembering the ancient practice of salt purification, decides to try consecrating salt to cleanse their home. She prays over the salt, asking God to purify their space and remove any negativity. She then sprinkles the salt around the rooms, particularly in places where arguments have occurred. The very act of consecrating the salt and using it as a means of purification creates a powerful spiritual shift. Over time, the couple begins to notice a change in their relationship. The atmosphere in their home feels lighter, and they are able to communicate more openly and peacefully. This isn't just a physical action, it is a spiritual one, aligning their environment with God's peace and holiness. Salt for protection and blessing. Consecrated salt is not just for purification. It also serves as a tool for protection and blessing. In times of spiritual warfare, believers often use consecrated salt to defend against evil influences, curses, or negativity, just as salt preserves food from decay. It symbolizes God's preservation of His people in the face of adversity. When salt is used in prayer, it becomes an instrument of God's divine protection, surrounding believers with His safeguarding presence. One powerful example of salt as a tool for protection can be found in the story of a missionary family serving in a foreign country. The family had encountered a series of inexplicable challenges, illness, financial difficulties, and even physical threats from local opposition. Feeling a spiritual heaviness, the mother of the family recalls a story she had heard from her grandmother about using consecrated salt for protection. She gathers her family together and prays over a bowl of salt, asking God to place His hedge of protection around their home and ministry. As the family sprinkles the salt around the perimeter of their house, they pray for God's angels to guard them and for His power to block any spiritual attacks. In the following days, the family notices that the attacks begin to subside. The financial situation improves, and their health is restored. While this story may seem extraordinary, It illustrates the practical application of salt as a means of spiritual protection and blessing. The salt, consecrated to God's purposes, serves as a reminder that God's protection is always present, even in the most challenging of circumstances. Salt in the offering of praise. In addition to purification and protection, consecrated salt can also be used as a form of offering and praise. The Israelites, in their worship of God, were instructed to include salt in their offerings. Leviticus 2 verse 13 says, "Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings." The salt here is a reminder that the offering is not just a physical gift. It is a symbol of a relationship with God, one that is enduring and faithful. Consider a believer who is preparing an offering to God. Whether it be in the form of a monetary gift, personal sacrifice, or a service rendered, before presenting the offering, they take a small amount of consecrated salt and sprinkle it over the gift. In doing so, they are symbolically asking God to sanctify their offering and accept it as a token of their love and devotion. The salt becomes a way to honor God, recognizing that all things belong to Him and that every gift is an expression of worship. A single mother, struggling to make ends meet, might decide to give a small portion of her income as an offering to her church. Before doing so, she consecrates the salt, praying over it as she asks God to bless the gift and to multiply it for His glory. She knows that, while the offering may be small in the eyes of the world, it is significant in God's eyes. The salt represents her faithfulness to God and her trust in His provision. By offering this consecrated gift, she is aligning her actions with God's will and placing her trust in His eternal covenant. Salt as a symbol of spiritual warfare. One of the most powerful applications of consecrated salt is in spiritual warfare. In moments of intense spiritual conflict, believers often use salt to break curses, remove spiritual oppression, or bless specific places or people. Just as salt has the ability to preserve, purify, and enhance, it can also disrupt and dismantle negative spiritual forces. The practice of using consecrated salt for spiritual warfare is rooted in the belief that God's power can transform ordinary elements into powerful tools for His purposes. A family that has been experiencing repeated illness, financial struggle, and relational breakdown might turn to consecrated salt to break the chain of misfortune. They may take salt and sprinkle it around the home, praying over each room for God's divine protection and asking Him to remove any curses or spiritual oppression. As they anoint the salt, they trust in the power of prayer and in the strength of their covenant with God. In the end, the consecration of salt is not just about the salt itself, but about the faith that accompanies it. It is an act of recognizing God's sovereignty over both the material and spiritual worlds. When salt is consecrated, it becomes a powerful tool that believers can use in their spiritual lives. Whether for purification, protection, blessing, or spiritual warfare, through prayer and devotion, ordinary salt is transformed into something holy, an instrument of God's will, capable of transforming the believer's life in profound and unexpected ways. Number 8. Salt as a symbol of blessing and curse. The dual nature of salt in the Bible. Salt, a simple yet profound substance, holds a dual symbolic role in the Bible, both as a blessing and a curse. It is the seasoning that enhances life, bringing preservation, purity, and grace. Yet it also represents desolation and destruction in moments of divine judgment. This dual symbolism invites believers to reflect on the spiritual significance of salt in their lives, recognizing the weight of its power depending on how it is used. When consecrated, salt becomes a vessel for blessing, but when corrupted or misused, it symbolizes a curse, a reminder of the consequences of straying from God's will. Salt as a blessing, purification, and preservation. In the Bible, salt is often seen as a symbol of divine blessing, particularly in its use for purification and preservation. God uses salt to cleanse, sanctify, and preserve His people and their offerings. One of the clearest examples of this comes from the story of Elisha and the healing of the waters of Jericho in 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22. The city of Jericho had been plagued by unclean waters, which caused infertility in the land. The elders of the city turned to the prophet Elisha for a solution. Elisha asked for a bowl of salt, and when it was brought to him, he threw it into the water and declared, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." Immediately, the waters of Jericho were healed, and the land flourished once more. Picture the scene: the people of Jericho, desperate and weary, gather around Elisha in the dry, barren land. The prophet stands by the water's edge, holding a small bowl of salt. With a simple act of faith, he tosses the salt into the poison stream, and the earth trembles as the water is miraculously purified. The people witness the miracle, and they understand that this act of using salt was not just a cure for physical water but a sign of God's divine blessing. Just as salt preserves food from decay, it symbolized the restoration of life to a dying land. In a similar manner, believers today can use salt as a symbol of God's preservation and blessing in their lives. For example, a family struggling with broken relationships or emotional distress might consecrate salt and pray over it, asking God to restore peace, healing, and harmony. As the salt is sprinkled or applied, it becomes a symbol of the healing and life-giving presence of God, turning what was once dead and barren into something vibrant and full of grace. Salt as a curse, desolation, and judgment. While salt can be a symbol of life, it also has a darker, more destructive side. In some biblical instances, salt is used as a symbol of desolation, representing God's judgment on the land or people. One of the most striking examples of this occurs in the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. After the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for their wickedness, Lot's wife, who had been told not to look back at the burning cities, disobeyed and turned around. As a result, she was turned into a pillar of salt. Genesis 19 verse 26. This seemingly strange punishment speaks volumes about the consequences of turning away from God and disobeying His command. The salt in this context symbolizes the irreversible desolation that follows sin and rebellion. Imagine the scene. Lot and his family are fleeing from the cities, the smoke rising in the background as the cities burn. In the midst of their flight, Lot's wife glances back one last time, unable to fully leave behind the life she had known. The moment her eyes fall upon the cities, she is transformed into a pillar of salt. It's as if the very salt that was meant to preserve life is now a reminder of judgment and destruction. The salt becomes a symbol of the curse that falls upon those who reject God's call to repentance. In this way, salt serves as a powerful warning. Just as salt can preserve and enhance life, so too can it represent the consequences of turning away from God and living in rebellion. Salt, in this sense, symbolizes spiritual decay and the barrenness that comes from living outside of God's will. Salt as a blessing and a curse, the role of spiritual preparation. The dual nature of salt, both as a blessing and a curse, raises an important question. How can salt be used rightly in the believer's life? The key lies in spiritual preparation and intention. The way salt is used, whether for purification, protection, or blessing, depends on the purity of the heart and the alignment with God's will. Salt that is consecrated, prayed over, and used with faith becomes a powerful tool for good. But when it is misused or turned into an idol, it becomes a symbol of the curse. Let's consider the story of a man named Jacob, who had been battling a series of spiritual struggles. He felt disconnected from God and caught in cycles of negative thoughts and spiritual oppression. One night, in deep prayer, he felt God prompting him to consecrate salt for his home, a symbol of purification and restoration. Jacob, following this guidance, took a small bowl of salt, prayed over it, and asked God to purify his heart and his home. He sprinkled the salt around the doorposts and in the corners of his room, inviting God's presence to fill the space. As Jacob walked through the rooms of his house, He felt a sense of peace that had been absent for years. The salt, consecrated in prayer, had become a symbol of God's blessing in his life. His home, once filled with tension and anxiety, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where God's peace reigned. Through this simple act of faith, the salt had been transformed from a mere physical element into a spiritual instrument for blessing. However, the power of salt as a blessing can be corrupted if it is misused or abused. Imagine if Jacob had used the salt for selfish gain, expecting it to work as a kind of magical charm rather than a tool for genuine spiritual transformation. In this case, the salt would lose its divine power and instead become a hollow symbol, empty and ineffective, much like the false gods and idols that were often represented by salt in the ancient world. Salt's dual nature highlights the importance of aligning one's intentions with God's purposes. When used rightly, it becomes a powerful force for good, bringing blessing, peace, and purity into the believer's life. But when misused, it symbolizes the curse of living apart from God, of relying on one's own strength rather than the divine power of the Creator. A modern example, the blessing and curse of salt in spiritual battles. There are many real-life accounts where salt has played a role in spiritual battles, symbolizing both blessing and curse. One such story involves a woman named Rachel, who had been struggling with a series of unfortunate events that seemed beyond her control. After years of battling sickness, financial hardship, and relational strife, she felt desperate and sought the advice of a spiritual mentor. Her mentor instructed her to consecrate salt and sprinkle it around her home, specifically in the places where she felt the most spiritual oppression. Rachel, trusting in the guidance, took the salt and prayed fervently over it, asking God to break the chains of curse in her life. As she sprinkled the salt, she asked for God's blessing to restore her health, finances, and relationships. Over the next few weeks, Rachel began to see changes. Her health improved, her financial situation turned around, and she found new hope and strength in her relationships. The salt, consecrated with prayer and used with faith, had indeed become a symbol of God's blessing in her life. But Rachel also learned an important lesson. Salt, when used without faith or understanding, can have the opposite effect. She realized that the power wasn't in the salt itself, but in her relationship with God and her willingness to surrender to His will. Salt, in the wrong hands or with the wrong intentions, could become an empty ritual. The true power of salt lies in its consecration to God, in its use as a symbol of His holiness, and in the faith that accompanies its use. Salt's transformative power, a reminder of God's presence. Through these stories, we see how salt can symbolize both blessing and curse, depending on how it is used. When consecrated to God, salt becomes a powerful tool for blessing, purification, and spiritual victory. But when it is misused or treated as an idol, it becomes a symbol of the desolation and destruction that follows disobedience to God's commands. Salt, in its duality, reminds us of the spiritual responsibility we bear in our relationship with God. It calls us to be mindful of how we live, how we use the resources God has given us, and how we walk in faith, whether as a symbol of preservation or destruction. Salt teaches us that our actions and intentions have weight. Just as salt can preserve or spoil, so too can our hearts be molded by the choices we make. In the end, the question remains, will we use the salt of our lives to bless and preserve, or will we let it become a symbol of our rebellion and spiritual decay? The choice is ours, and it is one that defines the very nature of our walk with God. Number 9. Salt as a spiritual physical connection, demonstrating God's authority over both realms. Salt is often more than just a mineral or seasoning. It carries a profound spiritual significance that connects the physical and spiritual realms, from the moment it is used in sacred rituals to its symbolic roles in purification, healing, and covenant. Salt serves as a bridge between the material world and the divine. It demonstrates God's sovereignty and authority over both the seen and unseen. the physical and the spiritual. Salt reminds us that everything in the world, even the simplest elements, is under God's control and can be used for His purposes. The connection between the physical and spiritual, the power of simple elements. Salt, though ordinary in appearance, is part of the intricate tapestry that weaves together both the spiritual and physical worlds. In the Bible, salt is often used in rituals that invoke God's power, connecting heaven and earth. Its purity and preservation qualities make it an ideal medium to symbolize the enduring and unchanging nature of God's covenant with His people. Consider the story of Jesus' interaction with His disciples when He calls them the salt of the earth in Matthew 5 verse 13. Jesus is not simply referring to salt as a seasoning, but as a reminder that His followers are meant to preserve the goodness and truth of God's word on earth. Just as salt preserves and enhances food, believers are called to preserve the faith and bring out the best in the world around them. This metaphor underscores the connection between the physical and spiritual. Believers are the salt that preserves a world in danger of spiritual decay. Imagine a humble fisherman named Simon, who had been living a simple life in the small town of Capernaum. One day, as he sat by the sea, reflecting on his life and his faith, he heard Jesus speak to a crowd nearby. As Jesus began to preach about the kingdom of God, He called out to Simon and the others, saying, "You are the salt of the earth." Simon, who had always understood salt as a necessity for survival in a harsh environment, felt the weight of those words. To him, salt was vital. It preserved food from spoiling, gave life in a world of scarcity, and ensured survival on long journeys. In that moment, Jesus was showing him that their lives, though seemingly small, were meant to preserve and purify the world around them, just as salt preserves food. For Simon and the others, it became clear that salt was not only important for physical sustenance but also symbolic of their role in God's mission, preserving spiritual truth and sharing it with a dying world. This powerful connection between the physical and spiritual realms would shape their understanding of faith for the rest of their lives. Salt as a medium for spiritual healing. The idea that God uses physical elements to demonstrate His spiritual power is seen in various biblical accounts. One of the most striking examples is the story of Elisha and the healing of the waters of Jericho in 2 Kings 2 verses 19 to 22. When the people of Jericho approached Elisha, their water was causing the land to be barren and unfruitful. Elisha asked for a bowl of salt and threw it into the water, proclaiming, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." In this instance, the salt was not merely a natural substance, but a medium through which God's healing power flowed. The physical act of throwing the salt into the water marked the spiritual restoration of the land. What was once barren and desolate was now made fertile again through the intervention of God. The physical act of using salt to purify the water illustrates that God's power is not confined to the spiritual realm but can also affect the physical world. Through Elisha's obedience to God's instruction, the salt became a conduit of divine healing, purifying the waters and bringing life back to the land. Imagine a family in the ancient city of Jericho, witnessing the miraculous event. As Elisha threw the salt into the water, the people were filled with awe. For generations, their ancestors had struggled with the infertility of the land. But now, through the simple act of using salt, their hope was restored. It wasn't the salt itself that held power, but the presence of God working through it. The connection between the physical and spiritual realms was undeniable, showing that God could use the simplest of materials to manifest His will in the world. Salt as a symbol of God's sovereignty over all creation. In the Bible, salt serves as a reminder of God's sovereignty over creation. Its very properties reflect divine truth. Salt preserves, purifies, and symbolizes the enduring nature of God's promises. In Numbers 18:19, God tells the Israelites, "Whatever is set aside from the holy offerings the Israelites present to the Lord, I give to you and your sons and daughters as your regular share. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord for both you and me." This covenant of salt was not just a ritual but a powerful symbol of God's unbreakable promises. Salt, as an enduring element that never spoils or loses its preservative qualities, mirrors the eternal nature of God's faithfulness. It is a constant, an unchanging force, much like the love and protection God offers to His people. The covenant of salt, therefore, represents not only God's provision but His commitment to His people, unchanging, eternal, and steadfast. Picture a young priest named Eliab, preparing the offerings for the temple with great care and reverence. As he places the grain offerings on the altar, he sprinkles them with salt, symbolizing God's everlasting covenant with Israel. Eliab is aware that this salt is not just an ordinary substance. It represents a promise that will never be broken. The salt is a tangible sign of God's enduring presence, reminding Eliab and all who witness the offering that the covenant with God is eternal, and it cannot be undone by time, circumstances, or human failure. The role of salt in spiritual warfare. Salt's connection between the physical and spiritual realms is also evident in its use in spiritual warfare. When believers consecrate salt and use it in prayer, they are engaging in a physical act that invokes God's spiritual authority. The simple act of sprinkling salt or using it to purify an object or a space becomes a powerful tool in battling spiritual darkness. Just as salt preserves and purifies the physical world, it can be used to purify the spiritual atmosphere and drive away negative forces. Imagine a woman named Miriam, who has recently been facing constant spiritual attacks. She feels an overwhelming sense of oppression in her home, negative thoughts, nightmares, and a general sense of heaviness. Desperate for peace, Miriam recalls the biblical practice of consecrating salt. She carefully prays over the salt, asking God to purify her home and fill it with His presence. As she sprinkles the salt in the corners of her home, she feels an immediate shift. The atmosphere lightens, and the oppressive heaviness begins to lift. Miriam senses that she has invited God's authority into her home, and that the salt has become a medium through which God's power is transforming her environment. In this way, salt acts as a conduit for divine power, bridging the gap between the physical and spiritual. Through simple acts like using consecrated salt, believers can bring God's authority into their lives, sanctifying their spaces and protecting their hearts from the forces of darkness. The everyday connection. Salt as a reminder of God's presence. Salt's role in bridging the spiritual and physical worlds also extends to our everyday lives. In the mundane acts of cooking, cleaning, and seasoning, believers can be reminded of God's presence and sovereignty. Just as salt enhances and preserves food, so too does God's presence enhance and preserve the lives of His followers. Every time we use salt, we can be reminded of God's faithfulness and His constant work in both the physical and spiritual realms. Imagine a father preparing a meal for his family. As he seasons the food with salt, he pauses for a moment and remembers the role salt plays in the Bible, both as a symbol of God's preservation and a reminder of His authority over all creation. This simple act becomes an opportunity for worship, a moment to reflect on God's sovereignty in the physical world. Through the act of seasoning a meal, the Father acknowledges that every moment of life is under God's control and that He is present even in the simplest of tasks. Salt, in all its simplicity, becomes a daily reminder that the spiritual and physical worlds are intertwined. Whether used for healing, purification, preservation, or protection, salt serves as a powerful symbol of God's presence and authority, connects the believer's life to the divine, showing that God works through both the tangible and intangible, the material and the spiritual, to bring about His will in the world. Finally, salt as a spiritual weapon, a call to action. Salt, an ordinary substance we often take for granted, holds extraordinary power when consecrated and dedicated to God's purposes. In the Bible, salt is not merely a seasoning or preservative. It is portrayed as a spiritual weapon, one that can be used for protection, purification, and blessing. Throughout Scripture, we see examples of how salt, when used with faith and in alignment with God's will, becomes a powerful tool in spiritual warfare and divine intervention. The call to action for believers is clear. Recognize the spiritual potency of salt, dedicate it to God, and wield it faithfully in the battles of life. The power of consecrated salt, a weapon in spiritual warfare. One of the most significant lessons about salt in the Bible is its ability to be consecrated and used in spiritual warfare. When salt is set apart for God's purposes, it transforms from an ordinary element into a weapon against the forces of darkness. Just as it can purify water and preserve food, can purify hearts, sanctify spaces, and defend against evil spirits, the act of consecrating salt, praying over it, setting it apart for a divine purpose, becomes an act of faith that invites God's authority into the situation. Consider the story of a woman named Lydia, who had been struggling with constant spiritual oppression. No matter what she tried, prayer, worship, seeking counsel, she could not shake the feeling of heaviness in her home. She felt as if something dark was lingering, affecting not just her, but her children as well. One day, she heard a sermon about the power of consecrated salt and how it could be used as a spiritual weapon. Encouraged, Lydia decided to act. With great faith, she took a bowl of salt and prayed over it, asking God to consecrate it for the purpose of purifying her home. She asked that the salt would drive away any negative forces, and that her home would be filled with His peace. As she sprinkled the salt in the corners of each room, she felt an immediate shift in the atmosphere. A heaviness that had once consumed her began to lift, and she felt the presence of God filling the space. The children, who had been restless and uneasy, began to sleep peacefully. In that moment, Lydia knew that the salt had become a weapon against the spiritual forces that had once held her captive. The power of consecrated salt lies not in the salt itself, but in the faith and obedience behind its use. Salt, when dedicated to God, becomes a vessel through which His power flows. It can purify and sanctify, protect and restore. In Lydia's case, it was the act of faith, her belief that God would honor her prayers, that allowed the salt to serve as a weapon in her spiritual battle. Using salt to break curses and bring blessings. Salt is not only a weapon against evil, but it also carries the ability to break curses and bring blessings. The Bible contains several stories where salt is used to purify or to break spiritual strongholds. One powerful example is found in the story of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, who, when faced with an overwhelming army, sought God's guidance and used salt to establish a covenant of peace. In 2 Chronicles 13 verse 5, we learn that God had made a covenant with David and his descendants, establishing a kingdom that would endure forever. However, the kingdom of Judah was in danger of being overtaken by a powerful enemy. In his desperation, King Jehoshaphat consulted the prophet Elisha. Elisha instructed the king to dig ditches in the valley and fill them with water, an act that would demonstrate God's intervention. Then, Elisha told them to place salt in the ditches as a sign of the unbreakable covenant God had with Judah. The following day, the enemy forces arrived to find the valley filled with water, a clear sign of God's miraculous provision. The presence of salt in the ditches was not just a physical act but a spiritual symbol, a reminder of God's unbreakable covenant and the power He had to protect His people. The salt represented the assurance that God would bless and preserve His kingdom. Imagine the scene: the soldiers of Judah, weary from battle and fearful of what was to come, watch as the ditches are filled with salt and water. There, in that moment, they are reminded that God's promises are not just words. They are an unbreakable covenant. As they go into battle, the salt becomes a spiritual weapon, symbolizing God's authority over the enemy and His promise to protect His people. When the enemy comes and sees the miraculous sight before them, they know that they are not facing mere mortals but a God who has vowed to fight on behalf of His people. The call to action: using salt for personal and community transformation. The story of Jehoshaphat serves as a call to action for believers today, to recognize that the power of salt can transform not only our individual lives but also the communities and environments around us. Just as salt can purify, preserve, and protect, it can be used in our own lives to bring about spiritual transformation, whether it is in our homes, our workplaces, or our churches. Salt consecrated and dedicated to God can be a powerful instrument for change. Consider the story of a young man named Thomas, who had recently come to faith. He was struggling with anger and bitterness, which had been affecting his relationships and his ability to move forward in his spiritual journey. Thomas heard about the power of salt in spiritual warfare and decided to give it a try. He prayed over a small bowl of salt, asking God to cleanse his heart, heal his brokenness, and help him forgive those who had wronged him. With the salt in hand, Thomas went to the places where he had experienced the most pain, the places of betrayal, hurt, and anger. As he sprinkled the salt, he prayed for healing and restoration. Over time, he noticed a significant shift in his heart. The bitterness that once consumed him began to fade, and his relationships began to heal. The salt, consecrated through prayer, became a spiritual weapon that helped break the chains of unforgiveness and anger in his life. In this way, salt becomes not only a tool for protection but also a vehicle for personal transformation. It represents the ability to cleanse and purify, to rid ourselves of the negative forces that hinder our growth and prevent us from stepping into the fullness of God's purpose for our lives. Through the faithful use of consecrated salt, we can break free from the chains of sin and brokenness, allowing God to restore us and use us for His kingdom. The responsibility of using salt for spiritual warfare. For those who choose to use salt as a spiritual weapon, it is important to understand the responsibility that comes with it. Salt, when used in faith, becomes a powerful tool for good. However, it must be handled with reverence, respect, and a heart aligned with God's will. As with all spiritual practices, the key is not in the object itself, but in the faith and intention behind it. One must remember that salt is not a magical substance, but a symbol of God's power and authority. It is not a tool to be used for selfish gain or as a substitute for genuine relationship with God. Instead, it is a reminder of the spiritual realities that govern our lives and the battles we face. Just as a soldier must train and be disciplined before entering battle, so too must the believer prepare their heart and mind before engaging in spiritual warfare with salt. Take, for example, the story of a pastor named Daniel who used salt in his ministry to help his congregation overcome spiritual oppression. Daniel did not use salt lightly. He spent time praying and consecrating it, asking God to guide him in its use. He knew that it was not the salt itself that held power, but God's presence and authority. Before administering the salt to his congregation, he made sure that they understood the importance of aligning their hearts with God's will. Only then, with humility and reverence, could the salt become a tool for blessing and protection. The urgency of action. Salt as a weapon for today's believers. The call to action is clear. As believers, we are called to recognize the spiritual power of salt and use it as a tool for good in our lives and in the world around us. Just as God used salt in the Bible to purify, protect, and bless, He invites us to do the same in our own spiritual battles. Whether we are facing personal struggles, battling spiritual oppression, or standing in the gap for others, salt consecrated for God's purposes can become a powerful weapon against the forces of darkness. Just as salt preserves food, it can preserve the truth of God's word in a world that is constantly trying to distort and defile it. Just as salt purifies, can purify our hearts, homes, and communities, driving out the negative influences that seek to destroy us. And just as salt protects, it can protect us from spiritual attacks, reminding us that we are not fighting this battle alone. The time to act is now. The power of salt is within reach, and God is waiting for His people to rise up, consecrate it for His purposes, and wield it with faith. The battle is real, but the weapons of our warfare are powerful. And salt, when used rightly, becomes a mighty tool in the hands of those who trust in God's sovereignty and authority. If you have heard this far, I certainly believe that you can see the true importance of salt and I hope that you will have God's blessings. Please like and subscribe to the channel so we can accompany you through many more beautiful Bible stories.